This is the Truth Be Told podcast, where we unlock the secrets of strategic communication. Welcome to this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast. I'm your host, Dave Thompson, and today's guest is Brad Beeler. Brad recently retired from the U.S. Secret Service after being a special agent for the past 25 years. He served on a permanent protective detail for former President George H.W. Bush. For the last 8 years, he was assigned to the National Center for Credibility Assessment at Fort Jackson and served as the course manager for interview and interrogation techniques. For 17 years, Brad was a polygraph examiner with the U.S. Secret Service. In this role, he conducted hundreds of polygraph examinations for local police departments throughout the country, primarily in cases involving exploited children. He conducted the most criminal polygraphs in the history of the Secret Service. Since 2011, Brad has assisted the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force by utilizing polygraphs to identify hands-on offenders. Over 170 of these examinations have resulted in admissions to over 500 victims. As a result of these actions, Brad was named the Special Agent of the Year for the Secret Service. Before entering the government, he obtained his master's degree in criminology while playing soccer in college and went to work in juvenile justice. In this episode, we're going to discuss the many roles of a Secret Service agent, ranging from running with the president to advanced security detail. We'll also discuss the nuances of the polygraph exam and the evolution of interview techniques and effective communication. Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Truth Be Told. I am here with Brad Beeler. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Dave. Appreciate you having me on. Big fan of your company and what you guys are doing, and excited to have a conversation today.
Yeah, well, I'm excited about the experience you have, ready to share with our listeners. If people are not watching, Brad intentionally put some badges behind him just to make this a custodial conversation, I think, is the process we're going through here. But congrats on your many years of service to the Secret Service, and some experience before that we'll dive into as well. Before we get into kind of the really neat background that you have, I'm curious if you have any insight to when you first started in the law enforcement field, before you ever went to any kind of interview training. What in the hell were you doing? And you have to walk in and go talk to somebody and you have no training, no experience. Can you put yourself back in that moment again?
Yeah, it was definitely tough. We had the typical 3 days of read, interview, and interrogation that we had in our training academy. But by and large, 25, 26-year-old kid going into interrogations. And I was blessed to have a really good foundation of senior special agents in our field office that could help kind of show me the way. I was really blessed to have a good cadre of people, and I've always been fascinated with communication. My best friend for the last 30-some years is deaf, and as a result, learning how to sign, learning how to really enunciate words so he could understand has always been something that I've really, really focused on as far as communication.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think people undervalue how important communication is just in general success, regardless of career field, but relationships, friendships, and a professional environment. Just communication seems to be fundamental to everything.
Yeah, there's studies that show 60 to 70% of career success is the soft skill of communication. You need to have those hard skills, but soft skills as far as being able to communicate takes you a long way in life. And I know with our dual mission in my former life in the Secret Service, it helped us in investigations, and it definitely helped us in our protective methodology as well. Is that I'm a big believer in, you got words, which are lyrics, you have the soundtrack, which is paralinguistics, the way we say it, and then you've got the dance, which is the nonverbals. And being able to put all of those together is what sells your message. Because, as you know, Dave, I can give somebody, one of my students, the greatest script on how to do this interview. And then I can give another person a bad script, but how they speak it is actually going to decide who's probably going to be successful or not.
Yeah, no, you're definitely on point. And the reason I kind of kicked off with that question is because you've got a really neat career, well over 2 decades of time with the service, and also conducting and creating interview training programs to help other people, other agents become better communicators, polygraphers, investigators. I know you're passionate about continued education. But it's always interesting to me to see, people like yourself who are so passionate about it and so good at educating now. reflecting back, thinking, man, there was like no training years ago on this kind of soft skill.
100%. And we dumbed our way through it, I guess, as much as possible. And I was blessed, though, like I said, to have exposure in grad school where I had a really good instructor that taught me about Paul Ekman. And I really got fascinated with Ekman's views on how to communicate. And I had a speech coach in high school, Miss Bertrand, and she was amazing. I was extremely introverted, but she really kind of brought out improv with us, being able to go right brain in certain situations when you feel like you're getting stuck. And I think that helped me as far as my communication kind of trajectory moving forward. And I always make sure I do that with my students, is I give them words they have to insert into their interview, things like that. So it keeps them constantly changing up how they're approaching things versus having a cheat sheet where they're just reading a script, so to speak.
Right. Well, what's unfortunate with a script is the subject or the interviewee doesn't have the same script, right? And people forget that. It's like you can't walk into a conversation so pre-planned. You need to be adaptive in your responses.
Absolutely. We don't have you have that teleprompter, but you're not really connecting, with that person. And that person, a lot of times these conversations, as you know, Dave, this is either the worst day of their life or a very scary day of their life. And they have these emotions. You are Charlie Brown's teacher to them many times. They're not processing what you're speaking off of your little playlist here. And so being able to slow down, enunciate your words, and being able to cement that understanding with your paralinguistics and with your body language is very important, because if I say something with an upward deflection versus a downward deflection, how I end a word can change the meaning of it perfectly. Like my wife, she's got 127 different ways how she says I'm fine. Right. And how she ended I'm fine is going to determine how I'm going to respond. So
right.
I think that is so crucial in our teaching. Is, once again, we've got methodologies, we have steps we need to teach, but let's really focus just on communication at the base level and how we enunciate words, our vocal tonality, our vocal pacing. I think if you can get that right, when you add in all the teaching components, you're going to be much more successful.
Yeah, and I want to get into, obviously, your experience with the service, with teaching, interview, interrogation, teaching and working with polygraphers, time at the National Center of Credibility Assessment. But right before I do that, and you just mentioned this point, do you think your wife or other significant people in your life have 127 different ways of interpreting also what you say? And so I guess my question there, mm-hmm. A lot of people that listen to us maybe don't have a badge, are not in investigations, but they still can use the same skill set in communication. So how much, I guess, of what we're going to talk about translates just to your everyday life?
I think you don't turn it off. There's no on and off switch. There might be a little bit of a dimmer, but the part that I have a problem with is in my old life was that most of the work that I did was missing and exploited children cases. So it's hard not to bring that home. So I almost intentionally try to shut that off because of what we're talking about. But I would say my wife has learned a lot just from talking to me about how you communicate. And sometimes I do turn it off to the point where I become a poor communicator at home because I'm almost like tired of communicating. And she makes it a point to bring that up. Like, hey, you talk about communication, but yet you are not listening to me.
Right.
So sometimes what we do at work, we turn off maybe in a bad way at the house is because we've done it for 40 hours, 50 hours a week.
Right.
But I truly believe parents, teachers, coaches, they need to be skilled at the same things that interview and interrogators do. And that, I think I mentioned this briefly, that the skills that I would have in an interview room are the same skills that I would use in a protective advance or in a protective threat when I'm talking to somebody. Is that those skills are universal in life. And it's I think a lot of times we try to pigeonhole our skill set. Communication is one that goes across the spectrum.
Yeah, and you've really, it seems like, made your career and impacted national security through communication in a variety of different ways. And that's what I want to explore a little bit. I mentioned the NCCA. A lot of people may not know what that is. I know you've spent a lot of time doing some training and some work with the organization. So maybe you could just explain a little bit of kind of what that mission is and what that looks like.
Sure. So I started in Chicago, was blessed to start there, big field office, lots of opportunities, protection and investigation wise. And then about 3 or 4 years in, I got to watch the polygraph examiners in the field office, and they were doing homicide examinations for the locals as a way to kind of pay back for all the work that the local law enforcement community does. Then they started really getting involved with child exploitation cases, which for me, that is something I'm so proud of, and I know all the men and women in the Secret Service are proud of, because since 1994, when we were congressionally mandated to work those cases, we've done almost 9,000 child exploitation cases. And roughly 5,000 or so of those have led to admissions in which individuals have ultimately got arrested and adjudicated. And so I saw that and I was like, wow, this is amazing. I want to have the opportunity to do this. So I put in to go to polygraph school, which we do at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. It's now called the National Center of Credibility Assessments. And what it is it's a 12-week training program where you learn psychology, physiology, interview, interrogation, and then obviously how to conduct a polygraph. And the beautiful part is that we have 31 different federal agencies that come there. So it's really a buffet in that the intelligence communities may have strategic motivations. The federal law enforcement community may have more tactical concerns. And then we obviously have an umbrella of applicant screening. So with that, I get to see, and I thought I had it all figured out until I went there. And by seeing all those different belief systems on how to elicit information, it really rounds out your skill set. And the beautiful part is having basic trainees from Fort Jackson to be our role players. So we could, the problem we have in a lot of research, and I know we've discussed this before, is that they try to couch it as science, but who are you using? You're using role players. It's very hard to simulate real world scenarios sometimes in science. And I think that was what we tried to do our best with down at NCCA, was we could use, if you're a polygraph examiner, you had a new soldier every day. And as a result, you had new life experience, you had new behaviors, so when those students graduated from there, they had conducted 40, 50 live examinations with 40 or 50 different people that had different motivations and things like that. So as a result, it made them better when they hit the ground running. So for me, being able to go back to Chicago as an examiner, help out the local community, then I did some protection, then I went to St. Louis, did polygraph again, and then I got the opportunity to come to the National Center to be an instructor. And once again, I thought I had it all figured out, but then once I got to see how all the other instructors were doing things, it rounded out the skill set once again, because I think that's a big problem we have is egos in law enforcement. We're all type A's. We think the way we're doing it is the best way to do it. And if you do that and you don't red team yourself and you don't, sit there and challenge the assumptions that you've got, you're going to fall short. And I think with what has happened with false confessions and things with, I know you're addressing that. If you just rest on your laurels for what you've been doing for the last 40 or 50 years, you're going to die on the vine. And that's something you have to challenge those assumptions, and you have to evolve as a person and with you as an organization.
Yeah, I think that's a great overview. And a few different things I want to unpack there. One of them we'll get into later on is this concept of, of trying to train people, trying to instruct people on something that we're experts on, right? Or you're an expert on a certain topic. And we'll get into some of this later, but I just want to get your take on this one example. I had another person I was talking to recently who said he teaches a train the trainer course. So he's teaching other people how to train whatever the content might be. And he asked them, do you know how to make an omelet? And people, yeah, I know how to make an omelet. You kind of know when to flip the omelet, when the pan is hot enough, all these different things. So when you're training, you got to figure out, how do you teach somebody how to make an omelet? You can't just give them do this, then this, then this, because there's a feel to it, right? You got to know when the pan is hot enough to put the egg in. When is the egg ready to be flipped over? And how do you teach feel? And so I'm just wondering if that story or how that resonates with you. Right? You've got all this experience. You're an expert in the polygraph and interview interrogation. But then you might have to sit with somebody and try to teach them some of this that's a little subjective. Does that resonate with you, or does that kind of keep...
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. For me, it's also partly, when are you getting this person to train them? I grew up playing soccer, but I hate coaching like little leagues, because you're trying to throw all this stuff at them, and what can they figure out? What does their bodies allow them to do at 4, 5, 6 years old? Whereas I loved coaching like high school soccer, because you can do more things. So it's finding, where am I going to meet this person at? If I've got a new interviewer, I may have to be talking to basically that metaphorical 4-year-old soccer player who's just learning how to kick a ball. Or I may have that seasoned detective that, they've done more than I have. They're coming from a major metropolitan police department. They work homicides all the time. I have to find what value added can I give them. So I got to find them where they're at. Is that, yeah, some people think they know how to make an omelet, and some people that I am going to come across, they can make an omelet.
Right.
So I watch them and see where they're at. And then I find out, look, am I going to have to crawl, walk, and run with this person? Or I watch them and I'm like, wow, this person is really good. They know what they're doing. So let's run. Okay, let me show them how to be the best version of themselves. And that was the hardest part for me when I got into training, was being able to identify where they're at versus just spitting out the same amount of information for everybody without personalizing what you're doing with those people.
I think I like that example a lot, because I think sometimes what people do, a huge gap in communication, is we assume people have information that we only have in our head, right? We either assume pre-existing knowledge, or we assume that they can fill in the blanks. But whether you're training somebody on any content, interviewing somebody, it's making sure that you are educating them on something that they may not necessarily know. And that could be a huge gap. And that could be from a protective detail, right? Advanced detail of making sure you're filling in those gaps for somebody.
Yeah, assumptions. They really cause us a lot of problems, because everybody goes through the same training, and we assume that they know that you should do this, but I think there's a saying about assumptions. I won't mention it here, but
right.
It tends to get
okay. We're rated
people...
explicit on Spotify.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
But that tends to get people in trouble. So and the hard problem is that you don't know that assumption is true or not until that bad thing happens. And then you're like, oh, shoot. And with us, and what you saw in Butler, Pennsylvania recently, is we had certain assumptions on what we thought maybe local responsibilities or what communications were supposed to be. And those assumptions got tested, and unfortunately it led to a bad day.
Right. Yeah. And I think what we can expand on that too is this whole concept of advanced communication and logistics. And whether it's any event really, is just trying to make sure that you've got so many different parties with different resources and interests, all like working towards this common goal. And I want to explore on that a little bit. But you mentioned polygraphs earlier, and I don't want to skip over that, because I know that's something a lot of people have an interest in. And you mentioned kind of two different pathways, right? You talked about applicant screening and also more criminal investigations. Did you have a preference into how you enjoyed administering polygraphs on one or the other, or is major differences between the two?
Sure. It's a good question. I had almost a 50-50 split. I was blessed in that the field offices I was in, I really had a lot of exposure with local law enforcement that needed those force multipliers as far as our assistance with polygraphs. So it was almost a 50-50 split. And the good part about applicant tests is, and I mean this I guess it's a good and bad part, is a lot of applicants admit to serious criminal activity. People don't realize that without a robust polygraph program, I've had individuals admit to shooting, stabbing, robbing, raping, child sexual abuse material, manufacturing child sexual abuse material, and trying to come onto the job with the belief that they might have to cause harm to our protectee. These were people that were what we thought, when you looked at their application, red-blooded Americans, and they admitted to these bad things. And so polygraph has obviously gotten a bad name in certain sectors. I think in the federal community, we look at a couple different variables. Really good training on the front end, and excellent quality control and oversight on the back end. If you have those things, you can be very effective. Sometimes the bandwidth on some of the smaller local polygraph, they don't maybe get the same amount of training, and they maybe don't have the same amount of oversight, which leads to maybe some people making some poor decisions or not having the same level of training that we do. There's issues there, but what I would recommend with people, just as far as advice for anybody listening that has to take a polygraph, is one, stay off the internet, all right? Because if you go on the internet and you type in on Google polygraph, you're not going to hear things singing its praises. You're going to hear things that are do X, Y, and Z to keep yourself from being a false positive, whatever the case may be. The best thing you can do to pass a polygraph if you're an applicant is be 100% honest on your application, because everything on your application is what I'm going to be testing you on. And if they've looked at your application and said, we deem you to be fit for this organization, you will pass that polygraph. Get a good night's sleep, get food in your belly, and just come in and be honest. And if you do that, you will do well. Where people have problems is when they leave that one thing off the application because they're afraid of how they'll be perceived. And that's not a polygraph issue, that's a you issue.
Right.
And that's where polygraph gets the, you go on message boards and they're like, I failed my polygraph or I did this. And yeah, but you don't know what that person didn't tell the polygraph examiner or what they did tell the polygraph examiner because you weren't there. So that's my belief in that anybody watching this, be honest on your application forms and your polygraph will go a lot better.
Yeah, that's really good advice. When you were explaining that, I had PTSD from, I remember when I took a polygraph and went to New York State Police Academy, I don't know, over 10 years ago now, but I remember I Googled it. And it wasn't like how to beat the polygraph. I Googled what to expect. I remember I was actually studying for our certified forensic interviewer designation at the time. So I was like in this chapter about polygraphs and what are countermeasures. And I think I got so nervous walking into the damn exam that I did okay and I passed and no issue, but it was in my head. And so what I am curious about, whether it's from the polygrapher standpoint or the applicant, right? I remember walking in, and maybe it's different, especially federal, but I remember having a 2-3 hour more of a background interview on the application itself. I was only hooked up to the polygraph for, I don't know, an hour or less. But you got these cables around your chest. I'm sitting on a pad. I got the blood pressure cuff. Yeah, right there it is. He's got it behind him. Perfect. So to me, it was just like sitting in the doctor's office on that butcher paper they roll out, and the doctor's about to come in and poke and prod. I'm nervous. So any advice on both sides for an interviewer on how do you help de-escalate that? But then an applicant in that situation, how do you put yourself in the right mental state to answer questions without that increased anxiety?
Yeah, with the applicant, it's if you know that you put everything on the application, you're going to feel a lot more comfortable. Where people come in with some anxiety is they're like, is that thing going to catch what I've withheld? Right. So that's the first part. The next part is get a good night's sleep. Some people, they work strange hours or they are anxious the night before, so they need to get in good sleep, because if you get your 7-8 hours of sleep, you're going to be in a better headspace. Wear comfortable clothing. Some people will dress way down, or some people will have the bow tie on and this. I know when I was an examiner, I would always have people take their jacket off, have them unbutton their shirt. I want to bring that Yerkes-Dodson level of arousal. I don't want them to be way over here freaked out, but I also don't want them to be sleeping. I want them to be right straight up and down, where they're going to be in the moment to give me good information, but they're not going to be stressed out. In a criminal role, what I would do a lot of times is I would offer them food, one, for reciprocity's sake, two, because the courts love it because you're providing them something, but also a mammal won't eat when it's anxious. If you go deer hunting and you watch a whitetail out in the field, if it's munching on the clover, it probably hasn't identified you, as a hunter. It probably hasn't winded you. And it's the same thing. Many times, if I provide somebody a granola bar and I see them eating it, I feel as if their heart rate, their adrenaline level is to a point where I'm probably going to be able to get good physiology from this person. Whereas they turn it down, oh, my stomach's bothering me, I can't eat. That's somebody I need to pump the brakes on a little bit, talk a little bit more, maybe hit the restroom, let them splash some water on their face to let that moment, that moment washes over them and passes. So it really is about identifying the person that's in front of you and not having that script like we talked about earlier, and seeing this person may need a little bit more time. So being able to identify when the person is good to go and when they're not. That's, I know we might talk false confessions later, but if we would do a better job, we know what causes false confessions many times. And when somebody is in that state, we shouldn't be questioning them. When somebody's a juvenile, we got to be careful. When you're over a certain amount of time, you got to be careful. When they're not on drugs, when they're on drugs, but also when they're withdrawing from drugs, that's huge red flags. So seeing where that person's at, meeting them in the right headspace, and sometimes slowing down, because we shouldn't be in a hurry to get that information.
Right. I appreciate it. That's a great example. And I think a lot of people listening too, that maybe they don't have a polygraph, right? In private sector, they got the Employee Polygraph Protection Act. They won't use it. But I would think that same fear, there's a correlation, right, between if I'm an applicant and I fail a polygraph, I may not get a job. If I'm a criminal suspect and I fail the polygraph, I may get charged with a crime. But even if I'm an employee at a store, at a retail company, and I get brought into a room by HR or by loss prevention, I might have that same fear without the apparatus in front of me. So I feel like the advice you just gave is really good for anybody that's going to have a difficult conversation is understanding the mental space and maybe the vulnerability of the person that they're talking to.
No, that's a great point. That applies throughout life, whether you're talking to your son, your daughter, your wife, your spouse, your husband, is that you got to find out where they are mentally, because our body language, the way we speak, that emotional contagion can be very problematic, in that what we put off can infect them and they can respond to that, and we are trying to read them, but it's really a product of us.
Right.
There's all kinds of things like this going on. So truly trying to find out where they're at and meeting them where they are and trying to get their heart rate where it needs to be. There's an interesting study that, it talked about, they were trying to replicate Ekman's Who Can Catch a Liar study. And they looked at everything, and they said what they found is that the only correlation they could find was that the interviewers that had a lower resting heart rate were more effective at determining truth and deception. Well, what does that tell you? When you have fight or flight, you can't process, you can't have a 360 view of what's going on. So, one, we as an interviewer need to take care of ourselves. We need to be in the right headspace. We need to be calm, cool, and collected. But also, if we're trying to get the truth, if that's the whole point that we're trying to do with our interviews, we need them not to be at 120 beats per minute. It's going to be hard for a victim to remember. And we are going to code that as they're being deceptive to us. No, they're just nervous. We need to get them in the right place mentally and physically so we can let them do their job, which is tell us the truth.
We just had a call with our instructors, our trainers who teach investigative interviewing, on the concept of cognitive load theory, which is a lot of what you're just describing. It's right. You got, whether you're an interviewer, a trainer, whatever you are, but if you are so distracted, what question am I going to ask next? And I'm worried about this fight I'm in with my spouse, and oh my God, my kid got in trouble today at school. You're not your best self either. And I think people forget, especially in the roles that you've had. I'm sure you've had kind of crisis interviews, right? Post-incident, critical incident interviews where there's so many moving parts, but you got to be focused and present in that conversation at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of what we would traditionally call shaken baby cases, we call them traumatic brain injury cases now, or head injury cases, is that you might have a mother that has lost her baby. What kind of mindset is she in? One, to provide you effective information, and two, to undergo a polygraph. And also, let's say she didn't do it, but she's in an abusive relationship. I'm a larger guy. I could be the embodiment of the abuser. In that, when we look at environment, you also have to understand you are part of that environment, and you may not be the best person for that interview, okay? I will say most of the time I truly believe respect will carry the day, and it's not about race, color, creed, ethnicity, religion. I know after 9/11 there was some look at, well, can female interviewers talk to individuals in Afghanistan and Iraq, because is there a cultural issue there? I think Lena Sisko talks about that in her book, where she really looked at, I'm a female, but I'm able to get information from these people because I treat them with respect. And being in St. Louis when Michael Brown's situation happened, I think I overcorrected and was so worried about tensions and this, that, and the other. I wasn't being myself.
Right.
Realizing if I just give you respect, I'm going to get that respect back, and I'm going to get that information. Sometimes we course correct too much, and if you engage in respect, and I mean rapport, respect, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You're safe, you're fed, I'm providing you food, I'm treating you with respect. That's going to carry the day with most people.
Right, and fundamental to rapport. I think that's fair. And I'm still stuck on earlier when you were talking about maybe your wife shouldn't listen to the podcast in case I bring her up again, but you're talking about all these different ways that we communicate in our tone and how we perceive things. But even knowing somebody else's other emotional state, I mean, I'm sure people listening, they know when is the right and when is the wrong time to ask a question of their spouse, of their kids, of their parents, because they're in that state of whatever it is, and it's the worst time to ask, is it okay if I go golfing tomorrow? Or whatever that question might be. Or even just asking what's for dinner, because somebody's just in that state. And so in such a silly, superficial example, now you take that to an applicant interview, a criminal investigation, and somebody's in that mental state. We should anticipate the same clouded response, right? The same distracted response. It's a good
Yeah, and it's an interesting point you bring up. So one of the Internet Crimes Task Forces I worked with, they would do their search warrants at 0600. Another would do their search warrants at typically 1800, so 6 p.m. And what I saw from those two different were drastic levels of effect, in that the ones that did it at 0600, everybody's home. the kids, the wife. It's a fight or flight reaction because there's somebody breaking into my home. Okay, and you just need to do it. Cops, that you have to do your job. But when the search warrants were done in the afternoon or the early evening, the people had chance to ingest food. They were typically in a better headspace. It was easier to potentially separate them from their kids and things, because privacy is one of the utmost things when it comes to communication, especially when it comes to child sexual abuse material and those types of cases, is that the male does not want to obviously talk in front of their wife or in front of their kids. And if I do that case at 0600, it's going to be hard to get around that. The kids haven't gone to school yet. So sometimes you can decide, hey, the best time for this is right after lunch because they've just eaten. They're not going to be hangry. That might be the best time to have that conversation with your boss about getting a raise versus at 8:30 in the morning when they just spent an hour and a half in Chicago traffic and they're just wanting to get their email set, and now you're coming in bothering them, or right before they walk out the door. So timing is very, very important in conversation.
Yeah, that's perfect. Last thing I was thinking about with polygraphs, and you mentioned some of this before, people come in either anxious or over prepared, and I don't know if you can give specifics or not to this, but have you identified people using countermeasures in polygraphs? And because there's so many myths out there of people putting a tack in their shoe and trying to step on all these kind of crazy things. Is that something that you've seen commonplace, or people attempting, or how does that?
Sadly, it's unfortunate because a lot of them have nothing to hide, but they've bought into the hype. And, like I said, it's company and organization is not going to spend money to be on the Google stream as far as what the search, responses are. So somebody goes on Google, types in polygraph, they're going to get things that are selling a book or a video or whatever the case may be. And what I try to tell people is, with 31 federal agencies, that many of which are handling national security on an everyday basis, would they trust polygraph if somebody could go in and learn how to beat it in looking on an internet site? That's what I just asked. It's unfortunate, but it's almost the best way to say to an applicant to be like, if TSA, if their magnetometers didn't work, would we use them? No, we'd find a better magnetometer. But I know what normal physiology looks like, and I know what produced physiology looks like. And that's the sad part, is you have a lot of charlatans that are selling books that are like, buy my $20 book and I'll teach you how not to, how to get your career. And it's unfortunate. It really is.
Yeah. I'm going to go back to, I said we're going to go back to this topic of kind of protective detail, and we can expand on that. But before I ask you some questions, and if you got really unique experience, you were, I think it was the Bush administration, were you doing some protective detail? Maybe you could just explain a little bit what your role was like during that time frame.
Yeah, I was blessed. So when I left Chicago, I chose to go to the H.W. Bush detail, which he lived in Houston. Him and his wife, Barbara, lived in Houston half the year, and then they went to Kennebunkport, Maine for half the year. So summer in Maine and wintering in Texas, that's always a pretty good mix. But just a great family. To be on a smaller detail, you really, the protectee gets to know you a little bit. They sent me to rescue swimmer school and boat school, so he was always on the water. So it was a lot of fun. I mean, truly, you talk about an American hero. I mean, joins up in the Navy at 17, gets shot down over Chichijima in 1944. If it wasn't for the USS Finback, he literally landed incoming tide going into Chichijima. He probably would have been captured and killed. And the biggest body of water in the world, he lands a couple hundred meters from the USS Finback submarine that pulls him on board. You talk about, just one of those amazing historical moments. CIA director, obviously vice president, president. He saw some great things in history and was just wonderful for us. So I did that for 4 years and really enjoyed my time in protection, and then got to go back home to St. Louis and get back into polygraph. So for me, I avoided DC, which is very, very hard to do, but I'm truly blessed in that regard.
Yeah. So I think that's fascinating. There's so many things that people, I guess, assume or perceive about what protective detail looks like from the Secret Service based off of movies they've watched, TV, interviews maybe they've seen, or kind of fantasize about what that would look like. But we'll break it into two sections. One is kind of the protective, maybe advanced detail. If a presidential figure, anybody of prominence, is going to go make a speech or go to an event, or Bush is going to a baseball game, right? Somewhere like that where there's potential, public opportunity. And then the other piece is just kind of day to day what that looks like. But I'll start with the first one. And you talked about this earlier, but the importance of advanced communication. And so
Yeah.
he's going to go throw the first pitch out at a baseball game. I mean, how many different parties get involved in kind of communication for those types of events?
Well, you hope it's somewhere like Chicago or New York or LA because you have an army
Right.
being the local police department. So comms are a lot easier. I think what you saw in Butler was you had a very, very small town, 5,000 people. You've got the county, the city, state police, multiple organizations, multiple levels of comms. They're not used to, and I don't mean this as a shot, because their job is not to do protection. Their job is to keep the streets safe and to respond to calls and those types of things. We in Chicago will have counterparts, or in St. Louis, we have counterparts that they know our protective methodology. They know the motorcade routes. We work with the same people. The comms and the 911 center are a lot more, I don't want to say high tech, but they're a lot more funded and staffed and so on and so forth. So it's a little bit easier in that situation. It's a little bit plug and play. If it's in Chicago, I know, hey, we're going to Wrigley or we're going to the old Comiskey Park, and here's what we're going to do. Here's the motorcade route. We are going to Hilo to this place so that we can cut down on traffic. We're going to shut down the roads here. We're going to have the inner, the middle, and the outer perimeter of all these locations. And you obviously hope it's an indoor facility, because if it's an indoor facility, that cuts down on the amount of overwatch that you have to handle. So unfortunately, that didn't happen, at Butler. And I think there's going to be a lot of lessons that come out when the FBI does, their full accountability. So the protection will typically get 7 days. When it's overseas, you may get more. I did an advance in Beijing, China for the Olympics. And, obviously in that situation, you don't have a gun. You have very limited resources, and you're hoping that the locals allow you to do what you need to do. So, but stateside, the locals are amazing, and without the locals, we couldn't do our job, and that's why we try to pay them back with a lot of our resources, because we work hand in glove with the locals. So that's protective methodology. When you're on a shift, I was blessed to be able to do the Bush 43 when he ran as a governor, and that's interesting because you're 3 weeks on, 3 weeks off. You're working 16 hours one day, 8 hours another day. You're traveling where they're traveling. It's as a 20-some-year-old kid, when I did that, it really is eye-opening as far as running with him, those types of things. And then you every September you would do candidate details when the heads of state come in for the United Nations. So Iran, Israel, that's our high levels, the ones I've done. And then you get, hey, you're going to do the Cyprus. You're going to do, some of the smaller countries that have lower threat levels. So something like that will be completely different, but yet we have to make sure they're not victim to a mugging. They're walking down the street. I remember it was a small Polynesian country, and I was the detail leader for that, and our protectee just ran right into a glass door. It was just very well done, and it was like 5 minutes after he arrived, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, this is my first situation, and now we're going to probably have to go to the hospital to deal with a cut. And so that's what a lot of people don't understand, is that you're with them 24 hours a day. They're sleeping, you're not. Obviously we've got multiple shifts, but we're trying to keep them safe from just general issues, or they've got a heart attack, or something bad is going on in their life. You've got to spring into action and deal with it. So that's the shift life. And then obviously our agents that were on presidential protection or vice presidential protection, it's a whole nother level than what I experienced.
So the shift work, and that's interesting. Like first of all, picturing having to run with a candidate, or there's got to be some pressure. They better not beat you, right? Like you got to stay.
I tell you, and Bush Jr. was very fast,
right?
And I remember one time running with him on the ranch, and if he'd have gone another 10 steps, I'd have had to stop.
Yeah.
He was in very good shape, and then he became a biker, and we literally had to send people through bike school because he was such a technical biker. So yeah, some of our protectees are very active. I know Barbara Bush, even in her later years, they would go on a Greek cruise every year, and she would swim from the boat to one of the Greek islands. So our rescue swimmers would have to swim with her. You just kind of have to adapt yourself to that protectee.
Sure. Well, that's obviously there's motivation to protect somebody, but the motivation to not get beat and embarrassed, especially when everybody's got cell phone video now, you would never live that down.
You would not.
For the shift work, I mean, how much of it just a regular? You talk about like almost every minute of the day, whether you're awake or sleeping or somebody's covering that shift. But normal things. Somebody wants to go get a coffee down the road, right? I'm trying to think of what's my life look like, and if I had protective detail, like how much do we not see? Is there any normalcy to that life? I guess that's the question. Is there any normalcy day to day, or does everything have this kind of
people? These people wake up on and do things just like you do. And sometimes we don't they don't have that level of protection in their country, so they're not used to being driven around. They don't have those expectations. And so it's a little bit of a culture shock to them too. Sometimes these world leaders, when they come in, is that we definitely have one of the highest levels of protection in the world.
Yeah.
So many times these people will come to our country and not understand you're going to have a 15-car motorcade,
right?
For a country.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And so the other first part you were talking about is some type of event management. So whether it's advance that you're securing a location and making sure that it's safe and you've got a path to and from. But then also on the scene at the time that something's happening, and I compare this outside of just these types of events, but any type of critical incident. And we also have a lot of listeners in the private side of the business who might manage large events where they've got maybe celebrities coming to their stores or corporate offices, or it's Black Friday and they've got thousands of people lined up at their store. And so I'm curious what you've learned as far as how effective and important real-time communication is during critical incidents.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think, once again, not to go back to Butler, but I think that was proven out, as you have siloed asynchronous communications where in today's society we're texting, we're emailing, we're not speaking. And we've went from cave paintings to Shakespeare back to cave paintings with our emojis in certain respects. We've devolved as humans in that sometimes you got to pick up the phone and speak to somebody. I mean, you've probably experienced this. You want to freak somebody out, call them.
Right.
You really want to freak somebody out, you FaceTime them, right? Oh my gosh, they won't accept your FaceTime and they'll text you. Is that we've gotten afraid to speak to people. So I would say over-notify, over-communicate, even if in the risk of sounding like you're micromanaging people, is that if Taylor Swift is coming to your event and you're in charge of that, you got to worry about arrivals, you got to worry about departures, you got to worry about crowd control, and like I said, ingress and egress on how to get out of that facility. And comms are what going to allow that, because you're not going to have the same level of resources that we do.
And you got to worry about Chiefs fans showing up, which is a whole nother problem.
Right. Yes, you do have those crazy Chiefs fans as well.
Yeah. The last couple of things I wanted to hit before we wrap up, I know a lot of what you're focused on now is, and in your experience, but is on creating the right training programs and educating people on communication and on investigative interviewing. And I know you talk a lot about how you can leverage almost all five senses in creating a comfortable environment, demonstrating empathy, getting people to kind of converse with you. So maybe you can describe what you mean by that. How can I use all five senses to improve?
Yeah, so I think Disney really did a good job with this in that when they're, when you first walk through the gates, they're going to try to hit all the senses. Everything you feel, everything you touch, everything you smell, they're hitting you. Everything you taste is going to be, it's going to take you home. It's going to bring comfort to you, and it's going to make you want to spend a little bit of money as well, probably. But they did a really good job of seeing how do we take in information. And too many times we might just focus on sight, which, what I'm wearing, the way the room is set up. But those are freebies. How I dress in a COVID world, in a post-COVID world, we got so used to dressing down that we don't look professional. If you walk in to get to meet your surgeon and your surgeon's dressed down and doesn't look the part, how comfortable are you going to be with that surgeon providing you care? And it's the same thing with your interviewer. My life is on the line, or my job is on the line, and you're the HR person that doesn't take enough pride in themselves. That's going to lead me to be a little anxious, which you may code as deception. All right. So how we appear to them, how our room is set up. I really throw this to people as far as set your room up to where it looks clinical. If you walk into a dentist's office and things were strewn about, would you feel comfortable about having care there? Absolutely not. The handshake, I can't tell you how important that is that is the first thing you do and the last thing you do typically in an interaction. And calling them the right name and then ending with calling them the right name. And not introducing yourself by your title, but by your name and then your title. These are ground balls that we can handle. When I talk about handshake, if I asked you this, Dave, what are the common things you see as far as what makes a bad handshake?
flimsy,
yeah.
wet,
Wet, yep.
overpowering,
Yeah.
and avoiding eye contact at the same time.
100%. So a lot of our politicians, they will actually learn how to shake hands,
Right.
okay? Because they shake hands and they kiss babies. But when it comes to shaking hands, you mentioned cold, or I'm sorry, you mentioned wet.
Right.
I will spray antiperspirant on my hands. Okay, but I got a little travel clinical size. So I've eliminated, and I'll be anxious. Well, when you're anxious, skin is your largest organ. Blood shunting away from that's going to cause you to have cold, clammy, creamy, moist hands, all right? And the way we can get away from that is I'm going to spray antiperspirant on my hands. I'm then going to warm my hands up. And I don't want them to see that I'm warming my hand up, right? If I'm walking towards them doing this,
Right.
that says I'm anxious, but I'm trying to control for that. But I have a little heater that I use for polygraph for sweat gland activity increase. And I'll actually hold that little hand warmer right before I go back to talk to the person or before they come to me. Then what I'll do is I will make sure that as I'm approaching them, I will make eye contact. But where I lose the eye contact is when I go in for that midair refuel. Because what we don't want to do is we don't have our hand that comes in. I can't really get
Right,
the camera.
right.
We don't want it to come in straight and touch their wrist because that's creepy.
Yep.
It's violating their space. But we also don't want it to come in like this because then it becomes all fingers, right? So I want to aim for that spot right there, and I want that connection to be made. And one of the things that helps me, Dave, is it doesn't matter your race, color, creed, ethnicity, but the bottom side of your feet and the bottom side of your hands is lighter color. When you look at the evolution of handshakes, think of it this way. If I'm Kit Carson and I'm out west and I'm meeting a tribe for the first time, what would I do with my hands and my body to let them know that I'm not a threat? Right. I would, 100%, right? I'm not here to hurt you. So what it's doing is it's showing I don't have a weapon. So that flash is showing you're safe, but it's also a nice landing area. And what I mean by that is we're always typing, we're always pronating. So I want that person, I will be at a 2 o'clock position with my hand, which lets them come in at a 10 o'clock pronated position. And that's where the midair fuel kind of comes together. And it's not the kind of shake we see at a press conference or that we see when the presidents get together. Okay. It is almost a grab and a hold, maybe one shake, and then off. But where we only lose eye contact is right when we're making that connection, and then we go right back to the eye contact. And also, too many times, what do police officers do? We do that, that we drop our dominant hand, our gun side hand, and we almost get that defensive tripod position.
Right.
That's obviously not a friend signal.
Right.
So I will get their preferred name. I will shake their hand. I will frontally align with them, so I'm ventral fronting, basically showing the most exposed part of my body. I might give them a little head tilt. I might give them an eyebrow flash. For the sole purpose of that subtle smile and the eyebrow flash shows interest, but it also keeps me from showing one of the worst things you can do, showing contempt. When we first meet people, a neutral face codes as negative. So I don't want it to be neutral. I want it to be positive. So that little eyebrow flash will show that friend sign. And that's, once again, this is stuff that Amy Cuddy, Paul Zach, a lot of these PhDs look at, and they'll do testing on to determine. Vanessa Van Edwards, they look at oxytocin levels when people do these things. So there is science behind it, and they're ground balls to do. Okay, when we come in with that stern face, my son, he's going to the Citadel right now. So last year as a knob, he basically had to stand like that for the entire year. We don't want to do that. We want to show our carotid. We want to talk with our hands. We don't want to be rigid. We want to be comfortable when we meet people.
Yeah,
I think those are some of the things when it comes to sight, and then how we smell. I know we don't only got so much time, but thinking about how all those senses lay out. How I smell, how the environment smells around me, is very important. When I first meet somebody, I want my vocal tone to be slower, and I want it to be a little slightly deeper. Because think of a time when you were scared, or if you're an officer and you were doing your first car chase, you probably sounded like the 12-year-old version of yourself.
Right.
We didn't always have 911 on radios. A higher pitched voice carried further in the fields to summon because that was danger. So people are coded to hear that. I don't want them to hear that from me. So I will slow down. I will deepen my voice a little bit, both at start and finish of an interaction, because once again, the science is behind it. So I threw a bunch at you there, but when it comes to the five senses, I think those are, we can talk, soft skills, but those are easy things that people can try out, and you'll see a big effect.
I think I'm glad you gave me all that information, because I think it's really important. I was even thinking about public speaking, right? You do a lot of training courses, but when we teach other trainers, it's that first 10 seconds that you're up on a stage with the microphone, that turns people on or off immediately. It could be a networking event. It could be a candidate as a job interview. Everything you just said, people walk in these networking events with their head in their phone and they're kind of looking down, their hands in their pockets. You don't even seem approachable. And, I've seen people up on stage do presentations where they spend the first 30 seconds, talking about their bio and the agenda versus just hit me with a story right away. Like hit me with something that says, I want to listen to this person. So I think that was some really good takeaways. I know that maybe we can do another one of these because I know that you've done a lot to focus on kind of the evolution of investigative interviewing. And so one of the last couple of questions I have for you is, what do you feel, and I know you could go on forever about this, so maybe there's a couple key things, but what do you feel like you've either had to change in the way either you execute an interview or what you train based on what the research has shown us in the last several years? I know you mentioned false confessions, which is something I'm passionate about, but other than that, what things have you had to change based off of what the research has shown us?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start this with just a little bit of a concept and then I'll go into the specifics. So we have to constantly test our assumptions, meaning if we go back to, let's say, I love to do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. For the last 12 years, I've done Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I think there's a story there in that in 1925, it's coming up on its 100th year, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu started, with Carlos Gracie. And the techniques that worked were taught. The techniques that didn't work died and are part of history. And then over the course of time, new techniques were added, but they were added because they worked, right? And that's the beautiful part about it is I can see something work and somebody can tap and we can reset. It's hard to replicate that in real life because you're dealing with my emotions in biology, their emotions, their human nature. We're dealing with role players when it comes to testing. So, and then we go into the UFC and we had echo chambers where you had 8 fighters, UFC 1, and they all thought, I'm going to win. I'm a sumo fighter, I'm the best. I'm a Muay Thai guy, I'm going to win. Whatever, boxing, I'm going to win. And then you saw one beat all the others. And all those other dreams were shattered. They're not the best. But then you saw UFC evolve to where they didn't rest on their laurels. Okay, I need to learn wrestling. I need to learn boxing. I need to learn Muay Thai. I need to learn all these different skill sets to make myself better. And I think communications is the same way. Look, that's great that you've got, you're in the traditional 7-step model of, say, interrogation or Reed, Wicklander, that type of stuff, non-confrontational. But let's sprinkle in some kinesics, some cognitive. Let's take strategic use of evidence and say, what can we garner from that? The problem with some of those is those are techniques and they're trying to design a program around a technique. For me, strategic use of evidence is not a program. It's a wonderful technique when you have evidence, but not all cases have that. So I guess my view on it is round out your skill set, find things that you can constantly learn from, and how can you adopt them into your model? Because too often we are afraid to look in the mirror and say, I'm not the best at this. Okay, or I can get better. You've got to wake up every day and say, how can I get 1% better? And your organization offers a lot of different training programs that I know try to make that happen on an everyday basis for people.
Yeah, that's a great summation, because I know you could probably speak to that. We both could go back and forth for hours on kind of the evolution of interviewing, and I think that last point you made is always stay educated, right? Have enough tools in your toolbox because no case is the same. But I also caution people not to have too many tools in the toolbox. Then you can't figure out which one to use when you need it. So I think knowing the appropriate time to flex or adapt to the scenarios is definitely important. I want to, been a great conversation. I want to kind of give you one last space here to leave people with, you've got, again, a really incredible career and some really neat experience, and curious if there's one takeaway on how to be better communicators, what you've learned over your career. And then the second piece to that is there any way to, I know you're recently retired from the U.S. Secret Service, but if there's any way for people just to kind of stay in touch with you and learn more about you, because I know you've got a ton of knowledge to share. So one last takeaway in communication, and how can people get a hold of you?
Yeah, appreciate it. You mentioned toolbox, and the way I like to think of it is if you were starting out as a homeowner, what 5 tools would you purchase? You wouldn't purchase an angle grinder, a laser level, random things that you may or may not use. You purchase a hammer, a screwdriver, ratchet set, whatever the case may be. And the reason I bring that up is you got to identify what is at your core mission. Whether I'm in the business, whether I'm in the military, whether I'm in law enforcement, what's my core mission? So communication with these people. Okay, so when it comes to that, what are the 5 things that's going to make me a better communicator? All right, pre-interview intelligence, getting myself in the right headspace before we start, setting up my room, empathy, non-confrontational, themes, whatever that is, whatever those 5 things are, drill down and say, these are the 5 most important things. So I'm going to do everything I can to improve myself on those 5 things. Not worry about something that I may experience one time in a career, because it's that 80-20 rule. I think that Kahn talked about it in his book in the 90s, was that, 20% of your actions deliver 80% of your results. So find out what that 20% is and really double down on it. Okay, a lot of people talk about, hey, improve your weaknesses. How about really drill down and improve your strengths? And if you can do that and don't have the ego to say I can improve those things, you're going to find yourself absolutely take off. So that's something with my students that I really drill down on is, I'll talk to, say, a homicide group, and we'll be talking about deer hunting. And I say, how many hours do you put into prepping for deer hunting? And they'll be like, I do this, I do that. Let's say they come up with 30 hours in this season. And I said, how much time did you spend preparing for your last homicide interview? And it's like crickets.
Right.
Okay, so now we got to work on pre-interview intelligence. Can we work on a tire? Can we work on your themes? Can we work on your handshake? Whatever it is, find those areas, improve upon them, and now you've got a toolbox that is more likely to be utilized on a daily basis, which is what this is all about. All right. So, but as far as I once again appreciate the time, and if anybody wants to get a hold of me, I'm on LinkedIn. I think it's Brad Beeler, 1865. It's the year the Secret Service was founded, as far as the header. And if you ever need anything, feel free. I do a lot of communications on there. So any way I could help you or your organization, feel free to reach out, and would love to help in any way possible.
No, great. Great resource, Brad. I appreciate that. I appreciate the conversation. We'll make sure to post Brad's LinkedIn account in the show notes. So if you guys want to go find that, 1865 is not his birthday, in case anybody's not watching or trying to figure out how old he was.
My kids thinks it is.
Yeah. But no, man, I really appreciate what you're doing, what you have done, and then what you're continuing to do to just move this industry forward, because we need to continue to embrace academic research while also realizing what is actually effective, right? What actually works, and how can we be better investigators? So I appreciate your time today, and I hope to chat with you again soon.
Thank you, Dave. Appreciate it.
Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And to keep this conversation going, follow the Truth Be Told podcast on LinkedIn and Truth Be Told CFI on Twitter. On behalf of the International Association of Interviewers, Rick Landers-Zalowski, and our valued sponsors, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast.